want to talk to you today about living in an epic. On my travels up here, we came through Victoria and we've been travelling up through Newcastle and the North Coast. Some things have become affirmed to me from my own story. Each of us sitting here have a story. A friend of mine says the world is not made up of atoms, it's made up of stories. Because if the world was just made up of atoms, what would it mean? But it's stories that make our world, give it a meaning, give it zest, give it direction, purpose. And the stories that we tell each other are so important. So I want to encourage your heart this morning with that. Coming through Newcastle, that was where my father's family came in around 1890. My grandfather arrived here with his mum and sister. His dad was already here, but his mum died only a couple of days after they arrived with typhoid, so he was left an orphan. He grew up in Newcastle as a miner, working in the mines at 14 years old, and eventually married and went to the goldfields up around Armidale, and he and his wife were there. They had one little boy, Eric, who died of diphtheria there at only 2 years old. But that was a very important turning point for my family, because they went to church and they asked, how will we know we'll see our little boy again? They were told, well, just keep coming to church. But they didn't really answer the questions that were deep in their heart, and they met a Salvation Army girl who told them about Jesus and how they could have him as part of their life, and that changed my family. My grandfather and grandmother became ardent, keen Christians back in Newcastle, often street meetings. I've got a great picture of my grandfather sitting in a park with a bunch of children around him, telling them a story. And the old timers tell me, when you saw Mr. Roe coming home from work in the mines, he'd be sitting in the street with a group of children around him, telling them Bible stories. So storytelling is sort of part of my family, and the love for the Bible and the love for the gospel. And my grandfather built a little chapel there in Tullara. His sons Lindsay and my dad Alan, they built assemblies. Dad built the Epping Assembly, helped build it. My uncle in Parramatta, they built camps, as the brethren do. So my whole upbringing was part of the brethren movement, and I just took it as natural. But, and as Bevan said, the elders we had at church were very kind. They were very patient with us when we were young men trying to make our own way, and they didn't particularly like our music, but they did back us because they knew our hearts were in the gospel. And as I've sort of reflected on my journey on the way up here, I was visiting my cousin who's in an old age care, and it's a place called Groves House in Newcastle, and it's named for Anthony Norris Groves. Anybody here heard of Anthony Norris Groves? A few of you have, the old brethren. Well, he was probably one of the great heroes of the Brethren movement in the 19th century. And I knew very little about him, so I was sitting in the car park waiting, so I Googled him up, as you can these days. And I was amazed to learn that this man, he'd been a dentist, very successful, he had a business, but he felt God showed him that the main mission he had, we have as Christians, was to take this gospel to the world and keep it simple and not to get too complicated with sort of arrangements and organisations and things. And so he took his family very simply across Russia into Baghdad, which was a very rough place at the time, warfare, disease. In fact, his wife died there. But he learned some powerful lessons about trusting God, and he wrote a little book, and I think I forget the name of it now, it's called Brotherhood, but or Godliness, Godliness. But George Mueller, a friend, read that book, and that energised his life as a missionary to the orphans of England. And you might know his story, living by faith. And then beyond that, Hudson Taylor and others caught the fire that was in Anthony Norris Groves' heart. And missiologists now say that he shaped the missionary movement that went to the world in the 19th century and still today. So they acknowledge him as one of the heroes. And that was good to learn. I thought to myself, Paul, you have belonged to a movement that began back there in the beginning of the 19th century that had a a passion to take the gospel to the world, to tell the story of Jesus everywhere. In a couple of weeks' time, we're going to celebrate Easter, not just here, but all around the world. And this morning we were singing in this little hymn book, the Believer's Hymn Book, about the conquering Christ. And it just seems impossible that anybody who was nailed onto a cross could be the conqueror. It looked the least likely conqueror the world has ever seen. And yet today, if you Google, you'll find the 100 most influential people in the world. Number one, Jesus. Why? 2,000 years later, he can't be a loser. At least 50 of the other 100 follow him. So I'm saying to you, we need to realise that we are the inheritors of a great story, a great unfolding story that hasn't finished. It didn't stop back there 2,000 years ago, but you and I are on the cutting edge of it right here in Australia today. Judges 2 verse 10, there's a little verse there that came across a few weeks ago. It says, "A generation grew up which knew not the Lord or what he had done for Israel." A group of children grew up not knowing the Lord and not knowing what he'd done for Israel. Well, in Australia, we're in exactly the same position now. We have a generation who don't know God and they don't know what Jesus has done for Australia. I am a historian. I've read a lot on Australia's Christian history, and it amazes me to see the footprints and fingerprints of Jesus all over this country. And yet, Christians and non-Christians alike go past those stories without having a clue of how much Jesus has given to our country. And it's my passion at this end of my life to energise particularly young people, particularly school children, to know these stories. I had the blessing of sitting a few days ago with my grandchildren down on the north coast, and we barely got there, sat down, and my little granddaughter, who's 11, Maisie, she sat down and she started telling me a story she'd been reading about a missionary lady called Gladys Aylward, telling me the story about the small woman. And you could see she got hold of the story and it meant something to her. And then my grandson, younger, he read me this, the story, might be William Carey, he read me a story about another Christian hero, and they had these books of Christian heroes. And it was a delight to sit with my children, my grandchildren, and hear their love for our Christian story that's so large, this great epic we live in. Do you know what an epic is? I'll tell you if you don't know. It's a long narrative poem telling of stirring and heroic deeds. And there's so many, I don't know whether you caught the drift, but in the hymns we sang this morning, they were about a hero, about a conqueror, a man, somebody who could die on a cross and cry out, "It's finished, I've won." I mean, it's an amazing story. And Jesus, it should be our hero. And it says here, I said here that these are acts that are awesome, inspirational, daring, deeds of reckless courage, men and women who didn't buckle under pressure, laid down their lives for others in an instant. And today in Australia, Christians are being told that their stories, not only that their story is no longer relevant to our culture, but that it's downright dangerous. And the Christians are blamed for many of the problems that we've had in our country. For example, the Indigenous people, the Aboriginal people, the story is that the Christian missionaries are the ones that really spoiled the story. Well, I'll tell you something about that in a moment. But we need to energetically revisit our own history, know our own story. How well do you know our Australian Christian story? So that we can make it vivid and authentic. It gives us authority. We have earned the right to speak in our own country because Christians have given so much to Australia, and it's wrong and dishonest and it's bad history to shelve it and to push it aside. You may remember the story of Daniel and his mates, Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego. We tell that story often about the 4 boys who stood up to the strongest king in the world at the time. Young boys. Who taught those boys? What gave them courage to stand up out of their own country as refugees, stand up to the most powerful man in the world and say, well, you can bully us and you can even throw us in the furnace there, but we're not going to bow the knee because we have a bigger story than Babylon. And where's Babylon now? And where's the story that they stood for? And who told them that story? I believe in their homes, their parents, their mums and dads had been doing what Moses told Israel to do. Tell your children the stories. Don't forget. If you forget your story, you won't know who you are. In fact, the Aboriginal people say in Australia, if you don't know your songline, if you don't know your history, if you don't know the background of your people, you don't exist. You don't have a history. And how can you know where you're going if you don't know where you've come from? And that's a great picture for us here in Australia right today. I believe this generation of young men and women need to be told their story because they need to know where they've come from and who they owe for the great gifts we have in our country so they'll know where they're going. In Hebrews 11 and 12, I love this passage because if you read the whole chapter, I haven't got time today, but man, this guy is so wrapped in his story as a young, I guess he's a young man, I don't know who wrote it, but he just loves the stories of his people. If you read Hebrews 11, he goes through that whole history of his people, the heroes, Moses, Abraham, Sarah, and lists them all, his heroes of faith, and he's gripped by it. And here's how the chapter finishes. And these all, having obtained good report through faith, received not the promise, God having provided something better for us, that they without us should not be made perfect. In other words, the story's not over. This great story of faith that Israel possessed, it's not over yet. And he goes on to say, let me just find it now, that therefore, seeing we've got encompassed about with so great a cloud of witness, so powerful a story, so many heroes of faith, we should lay aside every weight and the sin which so easily besets us, and let's run with patience the race that's set before us, looking to Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is set down at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him that endured such contradiction of sinners against himself, lest you be weary and faint in your minds. Somebody else has said, if you read the story of Jesus, go over it. It'll shoot adrenaline into your soul. Know your story, and it'll give you courage. Give you heart and courage when you're facing difficulty. And in this time, and I think young people in particular have been challenged by the world around them to the authenticity of their faith, saying, what right do you have to speak to us about Jesus? It all happened so long ago. Well, no. We have a great story. That's its strength, that it did happen so long ago. It began way back. In fact, Aboriginal people in the centre of Australia who reading the Bible for the first time in their own language said to a translator that I met last year, he said, they came to me and they said, this story comes from before the dreaming. This comes from way back. This has got its origins in eternity. And they understood that. And I want you to sense that we belong in this epic. We're not some little group huddled in a corner with hoping against hope for our little story, but we belong to the greatest epic the world's ever seen. This story has swept the world. It's brought amazing gifts to the world. Every corner of the world has been blessed by this story. And as Hebrews says here, it culminates not in a philosophy. It didn't come down with a few ideas for us to improve ourselves. It didn't culminate in a memorandum. Here's a list of things you might like to think about for life. It didn't finish with a manifesto like Marx's manifesto, driving us forward, good ideas. It climaxed in a person, in Jesus. God sent the truth into the world. I love this little phrase, a hero of mine from the First World War, he was a chaplain in the First World War, fought alongside the men in the trenches. And he had this great phrase, absolute truth needs a biography. Absolute truth needs a biography. What a great idea. God sent his son into the world to live with us, to embody the truth, and to live life on our terms, just like us, the Son of Man. He loved that term. So absolute truth turned up. It's been here. John said, we touched and saw and handled him. We live with him. We know him. And that's where the Gospels came from. You tell me where else, who could possibly have invented Jesus? He is absolutely unique. Nobody in the world could have thought of him. The Jewish people certainly weren't expecting him. They were expecting a great conquering king. And he ends up on a cross. The Romans despised people who they crucified. That was the lowest thing you could do. The most cruel, dehumanising life death you could possibly die. How could a God who died on a cross conquer the world? Well, he has. And you've got to explain that. And that's where we Christians have got to get on the front foot and not stand back, not hang our heads, but say, hang on, we have a great story. We have a story that has shaped our country, that's changed the world. Christ has been here. You know, something I discovered, simply like this might help you understand it, but it's a matter of, we each have a little atom of story that we're living. You know, all day, every day, you know, you can go down to the coffee shop, work, wherever you are, playing football, school. We're telling stories, right? Yeah? Yeah? Agree? Yeah, we're all telling stories, aren't we? We each have a story. And as I look across this audience here, I see people with all sorts of different ethnic backgrounds. You each have a story that's unique to you. God has given you a unique story. He's had his hand in your life, I think, and he's been writing chapters in there. And you have a story that's precious to God and specific to you that you can share. And people say to me, Paul, I don't have a story. Excuse me? You do have a story. Of course you do. God has given you an opportunity to live in his world and to experience this world and to do something with the gifts that have been given to you. What are you doing with the gifts that God has given you? What sort of story are you telling? Because the story that you repeat to yourself, that's who you become. A friend of mine taught me this little formula. Sow a thought, reap an action. Sow an action, reap a habit. Sow a habit, reap a character. Sow a character, reap a destiny. Begins with your thinking. What you think and the way you act, the actions you repeat becomes a character. The character becomes a destiny. At the end of your life, the bottom line in your life, what will the story have been? Will it be the story of following Jesus and seeing what he can do with your life? You know, I see some young boys here, you know, a young boy came to Jesus, and you might remember the story. He was trying to work out how to feed 5 or 10,000 people, and this kid turns up with his lunch, 5 loaves and 2 fish, which, when you're a boy, that's a big thing. You know, to give up your lunch is a very serious issue. Well, he gave up his lunch to Jesus, and Jesus said, thanks. We don't know the boy's name, but he said, you watch what I can do with your 5 loaves and 2 fish. People say to me, well, I haven't got very much to give. It doesn't matter. It's not how much you have, it's whose hands it's in. If you're still hanging on to your 5 loaves and 2 fish, you won't have much to show. You put that 5 loaves and 2 fish into the hands of Jesus, and you see what he can do with it. There's my challenge for you. I've talked about the stories of Australia. On this trip, my wife and I, Robin, we stopped in a little town called Echuca down on the Murray, and there's a fantastic story there I want to tell you, and I hope you don't forget this one, because it has to do with the Aboriginal people of Australia, who at the time, in the 1880s, were being shot, starved, raped, driven off their land and treated as less than animal. The prevailing opinion in the church and outside it, not all the church, but in the church, was they were savages who were beneath redemption. They couldn't be saved. It wasn't worth preaching to them. It wasn't worth educating them. And the best thing that could happen would be if they died out. And that was a prevailing opinion across Australia. It's one of the great sins in our country. But up on the Murray River, there was a man called Daniel Matthews and his wife Janet. They'd come from England. They'd been part of the abolitionist movement with William Wilberforce, wanting to free the slaves, which they achieved. They came to Ballarat, then to Bendigo, then to Echuca. And it broke his heart to see what was happening to the Aboriginal people. He said, my God, can this be right? Can this be right? what was happening. They were being given drink so that people could laugh and jeer at them. He would go into the men's work camps where the girls were chained to the beds of the men, and he'd fight the men to free the girls and unchain them and take them back to the place he created on the river called Maloga, and that's where we visited, to give them a safe place. One historian said that place was the only safe place in New South Wales for the Aboriginal people. Can you believe that? But it was a Christian man and his wife who created this space. There's another chapter of this I want to tell you, and I see some people, I think, probably from an Indian background. Yep, okay. Well, I've got an Indian story for you about Hero. Daniel Matthews took his Aboriginal group down to preach on the beach, the beach where all the rich and wealthy people promenaded in Melbourne, and he took the Aboriginal people down there to run a mission. And I think he did it deliberately to say, see, you think they're not redeemable? Here they are singing hymns that they've written themselves. They're preaching about Jesus, because Jesus has changed their lives. And this young Indian man, he'd come to university in Melbourne in the 1880s. He had typhoid, so his hand shook, so he couldn't finish the course. He was feeling pretty down that day. He's walking along the beach. He hears the singing, he goes across. There's these Aboriginal people from the Maloga mission up on Murray singing hymns. And he was a Christian. And he stopped to listen, and Daniel Matthews got talking to him and said to him, his name was Thomas Shadrach James. I love that name, Thomas Shadrach James. And he was a Shadrach. And he said to him, Thomas, could you come up to my mission at Maloga and teach the children, please? And he did. 40 years he spent there. A little mission school that nobody really knew about. The settlers up there jeered at Daniel Matthews for being a black lover. But in that little mission, Thomas Shadrach James and Daniel Matthews and Janet Matthews taught the people, treated them with care, treated them as human beings, taught them how to farm, taught them how to shear, tried to help them survive, gave them, taught them how to build houses and to live in a little community. And a revival came to that little community. And out of that community, Thomas Shadrach James began to teach the men and women, adult classes at night after they'd finished work. And out of that little mission, can you believe this? Remember this carefully, because out of that little mission came 5 or 6 at least of the Aboriginal civil rights leaders who changed the course of history for the Aboriginal people. The man I consider the Martin Luther King of Australia came out of that little school. It was that Indian man taught those young men and women, you have rights. God has made you. You are God's children. You need to stand up and say, we're being mistreated in our own country. Please change this. And he taught them how to write letters to the government, write letters to the papers. And eventually William Cooper, that young man who grew up there, married Thomas Shadrach James married his sister. He began to go to the government, and in 1938 with a man from Dubbo, where I come from, a fellow called Bill Ferguson, those two men I think were the Martin Luther Kings of Australia, because they stood up on the day of Australia Day 1938 and they said, we're still being neglected. So they declared a day of mourning to say, why aren't we being accepted in our own country? And they took a petition to Canberra, to the Prime Minister, and they said, the Bible says we're all God's children. Why aren't we being treated as such? It all began with Daniel Matthews and his wife, who cared for those people and loved them. It began with Thomas Shadrach James, that Indian teacher, who loved those young men and women and taught them to have the dignity of being human beings, creatures of God, to stand up for what was right and to demand from the government that they should be treated as humans. It took them a long time. 1967, before Australia voted, 99%, I think it was, voted in a referendum to recognise the Aboriginal people as citizens in their own country. But it was led by Christian men and women. I tell people, there are 6 memorials I know of to Aboriginal leaders in Australia, and they're all Christians. In Dubbo, an Aboriginal friend and I worked the last few years to get a statue put up right in the main street of Dubbo of Bill Ferguson, a Presbyterian elder who stood up for his people, a shearer, good fighter, but he was also a man of action. And he led the fight the civil rights movement to say we need to be listened to, we should not be denied. In Shepparton, William Cooper has a statue down there in Shepparton, but also in the Holocaust Museum in Israel, because in 1938, William Cooper, one of the few leaders in the world, took a petition to the German embassy to say what you're doing to the Jewish people, the Holocaust that began in 1938 in Germany. They tried to destroy the Jewish people. An Aboriginal leader went to them and said, that's wrong. And it was signed mostly by Aboriginal people. Well, the Jewish community in Australia discovered that only a few years ago, and they took his family back to Israel. They put his name up in the Holocaust Museum as a hero, because he was one of the few people in the world that stood with them. And they declared a chair in the university in his name. Can you believe that? An Aboriginal leader from the little school at Malaga, on the mission on the Murray. Who cares about them? That's where his name is. On the back of the $50 note, if you've got one, I don't have any $50 notes, but if you look on the back of the $50 note, there's a face there. It's a man who's been called the Leonardo da Vinci of Australia for his inventions and brilliance. He can play the whole Handel's Messiah on the organ. But he was an Aboriginal man from a mission down on the Murray, down here in Goulburn. And he was educated down in Adelaide, and he became a Christian and a preacher, and he used to travel preaching, and his little slogan was, if you want to know whether the Bible works, look at me. He's on the back of our $50 note. In Israel recently, beside the Sea of Galilee, can you believe, they placed a statue to honour the Aboriginal light horsemen who fought in the First World War there in a battle. And it's a statue of a horse bending over a grave, and this trooper, this light horseman, is burying his mate. He's an Aboriginal, you can see that. And his name is Jack Pollard. And in his left hand, he's got his New Testament. He was a Christian. So I say to people, you're telling me that the Christians, missionaries, only done bad stuff to the Aboriginals. Well, certainly missionaries made mistakes, but they've got a pretty honourable history too, and it's been recognised in our country. You know, even though these people all suffered, they all had hardships, and they were all on the back end, the wrong end of what white people had done to them, but they still knew that they could follow and trust Jesus, and that's why they were able to make a difference in this country. Well, I want to tell you just that story. That's only one of thousands and thousands and thousands of stories of what Christians have given to this country. And this Easter, we've celebrated the breaking of bread here, as we should as believers. But we need to be taking this story back into Australia. They're having a holiday at Easter because this story is real. 2,000 years later, why are we celebrating this moment? When a man born in Nazareth lived and taught for only 33 years, challenged the whole world to follow a whole new way of living. He said, he invited us into a great epic. He said, your little story and our little story here in Australia can be joined to God's big story, which is still growing. As it says in Hebrews 11, we read it, the story is not finished yet. Keep following Jesus, because you're writing a story. This is a living story that's growing as we speak all around the world, and you're part of it. We have the greatest story ever written to live by. You believe that?
Yeah.
You live by that? Yeah. It's fantastic, isn't it? Why do we apologise? I get tired of seeing young people, young Christians, hang their heads and say, sorry, I'm a Christian. What? Sorry for what? Yeah. Okay, there's things to apologise for. There's things that were done in Jesus' name which should never have been done. But man, I want them to hold their heads high and say, we've got a great story to tell. Do you want to hear some? I have a website called The Outback Historian. And if you go on that website, you'll find I've got dozens and dozens and dozens of stories that I've put up there, all sorts of people in Australia. And one of my favourites is a Chinese man called Quang Tart. He was raised in a Scots family down on the goldfields, and he used to wear a kilt and play the bagpipes. He also was a Mandarin, he had the whole throat. But he was a Christian man in Sydney, ran tea shops, he did great things for the Aboriginal people and for the poor on the streets and for his own Chinese people. He was the first to go to the government as a Chinese man to protest about the use of opium on behalf of his people. He said, well, the British introduced opium to China, it's your fault. You've got to help us get out of it. You see what I'm saying? We are so rich with stories, and yet we're leaving them lying, neglected. We're walking past them, we're scuffing over them as if it doesn't matter. This story that was written in Hebrews 11 did not stop there. It's still being written right here in this town, in this chapel, in our streets right here. The same story is still alive and well. Do you believe that? Yeah. This Easter, we've got to be getting out to talk to people. I want to challenge you. I saw downstairs there's some boxes of Gospels of John. I nearly stole one, but I said, well, sealed up, so I thought I'd just tell you they're there. But why not take a handful of those this Easter? And I think we've earned the right to say to people, you know, have you ever read the story of Jesus? Because I guarantee you most of them haven't. A generation grew up who did not know the Lord and don't know what he did for Israel. I'll finish on this note. I'm staying with a friend here. He told me when he was young, he saw a mate at work who was in distress. So he went across and said, what's happened? He said, oh, my wife's gone up and left me. He was an upwardly mobile young guy, fast car, good suit and all that sort of thing, but he was bereft. So Ken read and bought him a Bible and said, he was only young then, he said, well, here's a Bible, that's all he did. And he never saw him again because they swapped places, so like went to different places of work. Years later, he's walking down the street in Sydney, here's this voice calling out across the road, Ken! You know, and he says, mate, thanks for giving me that Bible, you know. I started to read and I thought, I need to go to church, and he did, and his whole family became Christians. He said, we're following the Lord. Just because, you know, Ken and his simply gave him a Bible. You don't know, do you? What will happen if you share the story of Jesus with the people you meet? Your kids at school, young men and women, us old people, you know, you've got next door neighbours. You might say, well, I've got to cross, you know, racial boundaries. No, this story covers the world. You know, it touches hearts everywhere. Jesus said, do your good works, don't hide them under a bucket. Put them right up on a hill, right up on the lampstand. So, men will what? Tell me. See your good works and glorify the Father in heaven. Do you want to glorify the Father in heaven? It's got to be more than just singing hymns here on a Sunday morning. As you share these great stories, as you understand them, I want you to get a hold of the stories of Australia. I don't care what country you come from. These stories belong to you. You have a right. The sister and brother, are you from Korea? No?
Yes, they are.
Korea?
Yeah.
Well, do you know that, and I think they would tell you this, I discovered that in South Korea, that they have a museum there for the Australian missionaries that came to Korea. Because they say that's where the gospel came from, to South Korea. I didn't know that, did you? There are so many great stories to tell. You all have great stories. You've heard of Thomas Shadrach Jones, you've heard of Bill Cooper, Bill Ferguson, Aboriginal men who stood up in the name of Jesus. What difference might you make in your place and space if you decide to stand up and say, I belong in an epic. I want to put these good works up on a lampstand where men will see them and glorify the Father in heaven. Amen?
Amen.
That'd be great. Father, we thank you for Jesus, the great storyteller who came and unfolded the brilliant plan that the Father had to rescue the human race. We could never have dared to imagine that Jesus, you would go to the cross and that you would turn the cross into a symbol of hope, something that Romans designed to dehumanize and disgrace and disgust. But you turned it upside down and said, no, this is a symbol of hope, because I'm going to die for the sakes of the world and I'm going to change the story. I'm going to tell a whole new story and you're all part of it. So I pray, Father, for us who belong to this story, who love Jesus, who want to tell these stories over and over and over, that you will ignite in our hearts again, shoot adrenaline into our souls, through this great story that we own, that we belong to, that we'll come to know it well and tell it. Our Australian story, our own little personal story, what Jesus has done for us, for our country. And we pray that you'll unleash revival in our own country as we set about telling this great story, this epic that we belong to. In Jesus' name, amen.